presentation. If you have any comments or issues that come up, please post those to the chat. So without further ado, I will go ahead and unmute, and he should be all set to go. Alrighty, can you hear me? All right, we'll try. Oh, hold on a second.
Unmute.
There we go. I can hear you. I can hear you, Doctor.
Perfect. That's fine. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. And first of all, thank you for having me here. This is a real pleasure. Today, I would like to discuss with you a problem which is not simple, a topic which is not simple. It's the topic of wicked problems, which are the center of what I called in this presentation, the title of this presentation, The Age of Coronavirus. So without further ado, I will introduce a little bit the structure of this presentation. The idea of the whole presentation is discussing what is really affecting us, all of us as a global community nowadays, which is the challenge presented by global problems, wicked problems like the COVID-19 pandemic. And after talking a little bit about what these types of problems are, why they are really nasty, why they're called wicked, I will, in Act 2 of this presentation, I will discuss a little bit the approaches to engage in these problems. And then finally, in Act 3, I will discuss a little bit how and why games could make a difference in developing our ability to deal with these nasty problems. So let's start with a little bit of an introduction. So what is the age of COVID-19? Why did I call it the age of COVID-19? Obviously, what we're seeing around us are forces which are unpredictable, uncontrollable, and unknowable, and they are generating upheavals that are affecting in interconnected ways our society, our environment, and our economy. Now, the interesting thing and the scary thing is that these forces come from a particular type of problem, which are the wicked problems. And these are problems that threaten our future and our future in need. And they defy all the standard approaches to problem solving. So let's start digging into this. But before entering into technicalities of what wicked problems are, I would like to reflect with you for a minute on what is surrounding us, because I think that might be the best way of getting a grasp of why these types of problems are called wicked. So what we're seeing is obviously a very interesting and concerning phenomenon that started with a tiny little bug that became a pandemic. And of course, this pandemic affected directly people's well-being, and sometimes, unfortunately, with very tragic consequences. And in turn, these consequences further affected people's well-being, particularly in terms of mental health. Of course, the situation led to increased pressure on health services, and in some cases, the insufficiency of the resources that they relied on led to even more tragic consequences, which affected even more people's well-being and particularly mental health. Of course, COVID affected directly health services, because unfortunately, health carers are a category at risk, and this meant actually that they need to be protected, and hospitals need resources, and this means actually pressure on the government. Pressure on the government came directly from the pandemic because they're not immune to the virus, and in some countries actually politicians being affected by the virus meant a significant disruption in the way governments functioned. And by the way, of course, there's a concern from many governments to protect people's well-being, and that meant actually implementing measures like social distancing, like lockdown, and which also cause disruptions in everyday activities such as jobs, and in turn increased the pressure on governments, which had to mitigate the risks of lost incomes by investing money and subsidizing people, at least in European countries, for example. And by the way, all this happened and meant an incredible impact on the economy, which in turn meant additional pressures on governments because they had to subsidize the economy. Not everything is red. Some green things, I've put them in this chart as well. It's interesting to see how nature is reclaiming its space in very many occasions. And it's also interesting to see how people are reorganizing and discovering new forms of being together and socializing and so on and so forth. Now, why did I put this seemingly chaotic chart all together, this diagram? By looking at this, could you tell me what the problem is? And could you imagine what the solution to whatever the problem is could be? And I didn't even talk about the possible causes for this problem. So this is actually the nature of wicked problems. The more you think about them, the less you can figure out the clear way of getting out of them. And we will see actually that the problem is how we think about them, and particularly how we feel about them. So what are wicked problems and why are they challenging? Well, first of all, they are problems, but they're not ordinary problems. So they are problems in that there are situations in which you have an initial state. The initial state is not pleasant and you want to change it. So what happens is that you think about how to change the problem. You imagine an ideal final state, a solution approach. You implement the solution approach and you win, you solve the problem. So far, wicked problems are similar in that they are inconvenient, they are undecidable conjunctures, they compromise individuals, societies, and the broader environment. The problem is that you cannot just think about them, find a solution approach, implement the solution approach, and solve the problem. First of all, they are ill-defined. So that means actually that the conditions that define the problem as such are not clear, but also the possible goals are not clear and the possible methods are not clear. And then they are complex. So they are defined by great many interacting factors which change over times. And this goes beyond what I define complicatedness. So all these together means that wicked problems are literally problem-solving layers in that they defeat completely all the traditional approaches to problem solving. So the main reason why this is so is that they are complex. And as I said before, this is something that goes beyond complicatedness. So they stem from great many factors interacting in great many different ways. And this makes them, of course, complicated. They are complicated indeed. However, there is more. The way these factors interact and the factors themselves change over time and change in an autonomous way in response to whatever is happening around them. And the other interesting thing is that the effects of their interactions sometimes are holistic phenomena that cannot be explained, let alone predicted by looking at the individual parts and specific interactions between parts. So this is really what defines the complexity of wicked problems. And more importantly, this is what makes them non-completely knowable, uncertain, non-completely predictable, actually hardly predictable at all. And more importantly, all this together means that they cannot be controlled as we would do with traditional problems. Now that's really bad. So, but it's not all. There's another thing, which is that wicked problems never come alone. When you see one, there are many, and there are many of them that interact, which of course makes tackling wicked problems even harder. And to wrap everything up, there's one more thing, which is that they always affect diverse stakeholders with different interests, with different needs, and very often conflicting needs. So in a nutshell, what happens is that when it rains in the world of wicked problems, it really pours. And the issue is that more often than not, it rains in the world of wicked problems. So what happens then? What should be done to tackle wicked problems? Well, as I said, traditional approaches do not work. So what needs to be done is actually not even attempting to solve a wicked problem. They need to be managed, and they need to be managed iteratively through what we call a double loop learning process. So let me talk a little bit about this. It all starts with defining assumptions about how things work, how elements interact, what the problem is, what should be done, and why, and defining goals, strategies, and techniques to tackle the problem based on these assumptions. So, of course, action follows to planning. And then, very important, you need to monitor all the time what's going on in terms of both outcomes of action, but also other environmental events. Why? Because they might require a significant revision of plans, but also a revision of assumptions underpinning the plans that you've enacted. So the interesting thing about this is that this is an incredibly complicated process to enact, not only because of the nature of the process itself, but because of what it implies. And so, first of all, this process implies that there is no sticking to the plan. So people have to forego the illusion of control, which is pretty hard. Secondly, this process relies on a continued meaning-making cycle that makes you question and define iteratively what should be done, how and why. That means actually that you have to accept the idea that you never figured it out. Otherwise, you will not engage in this continuous meaning-making process. And that's pretty difficult. Accepting that you never figured it out is difficult. The other important thing here is that this process, because of this double loop learning aspect, means that you have to learn and unlearn continuously. Redefining assumptions and redefining goals, strategies, and techniques can only be done through learning something new, but also unlearning something that perhaps until now you tried to stick to. And then there's another important thing, which is that redefining assumptions mean questioning your own beliefs. It means a revision of worldviews that may actually shake something that you might have very entrenched in your head, in your culture, whatever it is. So another interesting thing that makes everything very difficult. We want to add another element. All this has to be done together through collective thinking, collective feeling, and collective doing. So it's pretty difficult. And because it's pretty difficult, enacting that process requires specific attitudes, specific skill sets, and specific information. And through our past research, we've actually identified some of these attitudes, skill sets, and information, or types of attitudes, skill set, and information. And I'll briefly discuss this. In terms of attitudes, there's an important thing here. Why am I starting with attitudes? Because when people talk about problems, very often they think about rational thinking. We have to analyze, we have to figure it out. The problem with wicked problems is that that is not sufficient. You need attitudes, you need feeling. If feeling don't work with rationality, you're dead. As simple as that. And the kind of attitudes that we need are these ones. So you need affective dispositions that can motivate meaningful action. And these include a sense of global belongingness. We're rolling this together with our environment. I mean, emotional commitment to sustainable development, which means sense of responsibility to safeguard the future of ourselves and our environment. Compassionate altruism, which basically means caring about the others. Adaptivity, knowing that whatever happens, you can actually adapt and you can make it. confidence in action capacity, which means actually having confidence in your ability to act no matter what is surrounding you, which goes together with hope in the effects of actions, which means actually that you have to be hopeful that whatever you do is going to have an impact and that the impact can improve things. Now, if you look at these six types of attitudes, you can notice that basically, in a nutshell, they are suggesting that we should look after each other and our environment, and we should be confident that whatever is the chaos that surrounds us, we can adapt and actually change things in a positive way. So very important attitudes. Then you have, of course, skill sets, because you need to interact with the world. And for that, you need skills. And the core skill set that we've identified through our past research are capabilities which are required for practical interaction with the world. And they include key forms of higher order thinking, such as creative thinking, system thinking, ill-defined problem solving, and analogical reasoning. Altogether with social skill sets, including pluralism, the ability to recognize and accept diversity in perspectives, negotiation, dialogue, communication, and sharing. And of course, operational skill sets. Depending on the context where you are, you will need to operate things, practical things. And of course, for this, you need operational skill sets. Last but not least, there is information. So information is obviously, to some extent, domain specific. So I cannot list what kind of information you need. It depends on the problem scenario that you're tackling. Then, however, there are two important things. Whatever is the information that you need, it has to be transdisciplinary in that it has to integrate different areas relevant to the domain that you're tackling. And it also has to be pluralistic, meaning that it has to include different perspectives relevant to the situation that you're tackling, eventually even conflicting perspectives. So these types of attitudes, skill sets, and information are all equally needed to tackle wicked problem situations. And they're all needed together. And in fact, through our past research, we explored the integration of these three types of assets. I'd like to define them. And we generated this framework of the chaotic agency, which we called chaotic agency, referring to the fact that information, skill set, and attitudes all together need to be used in order to pursue the common good and bring about order from seeming chaos. And so the interesting thing about this is that developing in an integrated way all these attitudes, these skill sets, and acquiring the information required to tackle wicked problem situations is not easy. Of course, you need education, but the issue is standard education. Well, it has many shortfalls to really promote this. Why? Let me show you some important conditions that learning for chaotic agency requires. So first of all, you need the possibility to practically experiment with complex situations, which is already something that you may struggle to find in traditional educational environments. You also need to engage in scenarios that reflect real world meanings. You need to expose learners to uncertainty, unknowability, unpredictability, and uncontrollability, which is dissonant with what is done in many formal educational environments, of course. And then finally, you need to engage learners in collective behaviors centered on collectively identifying and pursuing the common good, planning, acting, evaluating iteratively and adaptively together, focusing on the big picture and possibly the implications of all the actions carried out and other events. And then learn and unlearn through meaningful activity, not in a classroom. So the issue here is that games can make a difference. They can help, and they can represent tremendously powerful learning environment to develop chaotic agency and promote, nurture literally chaotic agents, people able to identify wicked problems in reality and motivated and capable to engage in those wicked problems together. However, there are some things that need to be taken into account when designing serious games for this purpose. And this is the final act of this presentation. So how should games be designed to foster chaotic agency? Well, there are three big aspects that need to be taken into account. First of all, we act and make sense of things in context. So designing a game has to be overall approached as the act of designing contexts. And so the first thing that pops out is that activity, gameplay activity, should be designed as a situated process, so contextualized, driven by meaning making. The second important thing is that the settings in which players engage should be designed to mirror real-world wicked problem scenarios. And the final big theme is that players should be engaged in situations that reproduce key conditions of complexity and require them to act collectively, iteratively, and adaptively. So let's dig into each one of these. The first one is particularly interesting in terms of design thinking because it's about promoting gameplay as a situated activity driven by meaning making and entailing learning. It all starts with thinking about the player and thinking that whenever they play, players face a gameplay context, a designed gameplay context that involves an environment, a physical environment. It involves culture and history, so conditions that determine how and why people interact, conflicts, and so on and so forth. They actually define the social aspect of this environment. There are designed objectives and rules, and there are elements, objects that are designed as barriers and facilitators for the gameplay activity. So this is pretty much all the things that we design. We have to take into account that the way players work is by perceiving these gameplay context and based on their perception, engaging in rather complex meaning-making processes. Up front, I would like to emphasize that meaning-making, once again, is not about thinking. It's about thinking as much as feeling. This is how the mind works if we take it through this perspective, right? And because of the combination and the interplay of feeling and thinking, players start interpreting the reality that they're facing. So they start interpreting what, how, and why has happened, is happening, and could happen. And through this interpretation process, what happens is that they then decide what, how, and why should be done. After deciding this, what happens is that, of course, they interact with the gameplay context and interact with the context to either explore more or to transform the gameplay context, whether alone or together with other players. Another interesting thing about this process is that entails learning naturally. Why? Because as you try to make sense of things, obviously, you have to acquire, process, assimilate information, and you have to develop skill set and attitudes. And as you interact with the world, you have to practice your skill sets and therefore eventually improve your skill sets. But you're also influenced by further events that then feed into meaning-making process, which may further change your attitudes and provide more information and so on and so forth. So this is not about, the message here is that this picture is not about embedding learning into gameplay, because it is already embedded into gameplay. By considering gameplay as a meaning-making driven process, then we can think about, in a rather better way, all the learning that is naturally embedded in gameplay and orient it towards, in this particular case, hopefully, the development of chaotic agency. So how do we support this process? How do we support this gameplay driven by meaning making and entailing learning? By design, what we need to do, well, there are many things, of course. I highlighted some things that I think are particularly important. So players need information and support. Otherwise, the meaning making process is not going to work. And that means, for starters, embedding in-game contents and meanings which are relevant to real-world wicked problems. But of course, players can only perceive these contents if they have the right information in the right place and at the right time. And this means that all designers should take into account the need to design information flow mechanisms that can allow players to interpret a variety of things, in particular, the play space, effects of events in the play space, outcomes of their actions, indirect effects of their actions, indirect effects of other events, progress in gameplay activities, and progress in related gameplay processes. Other mechanisms should be implemented so that players can be supported and oriented towards relevant events that need to be explored and needs to be experimented. And support and orientation is also required for the learning processes in an adaptive way. That means actually that we have to create systems in which it is possible to monitor what players are doing, and then depending on their progress, react and provide orientation and support. And equally important is to reward progress, both in terms of gameplay and in terms of learning. And doing that through meaningful transformations of the game environment. I think that accolades, leaderboards, and medals are not that effective when we talk about wicked problems. So the other point was promoting real-world contextualization of gameplay. Now, the interesting thing about this is that it's obvious, but there might be not so obvious aspects to it. So players need to engage with relevant situations. And in terms of design, there's an important thing, which are the designed gameplay motives. Whenever we design a game, and we're talking about obviously sophisticated games, games that have an important setting, maybe a narrative and so on and so forth. When we design these types of games, we think about, or we should think about, why should player play? Why should player engage in something? What is the importance of that something? Why is it meaningful? Why is it relevant in the game world? Why is it appreciated in the game world? And to what extent that relevance, that significance in the game world can map to what players consider important. So we have designed motives that explain why action is needed. Those motives should be carefully selected to reflect motives that could effectively motivate action in real-world wicked problem scenarios. And therefore, these motives should be useful to motivate literally players to explore and internalize relevant motivations, motivations that they will find out there in the real world later on. Another important thing are conflicts, challenges, and opportunities. We design those things in games, and they should also mirror real-world wicked problem scenarios. This is particularly important and useful so that players can familiarize with real-world patterns and stereotypical situations that you may find in wicked problem scenarios. Last but not least, it's important to require exploratory and transformative actions and interactions with the real world. And that's another important thing. So I am a big advocate of mixed reality because I think that if there is an element of interaction with the physical world, then the experience changes. And that kind of experience can change the way we look at non-gaming interactions with the real world. And of course, this is also useful to familiarize players with real-world meanings, functions, and interactions. So the last point that I highlighted, which is important in terms of design, is promoting player engagement with complexity. You have to play with complexity somehow in order to learn how to do it, right? And this can only happen if you find complexity in gameplay activities. So the starting point is thinking about the ill definition of problems that players have to face. Whatever the game is, if there is a goal, there is a problem. There is a need for a change. So we're not talking about complex problems in terms of mathematics and things like that. We're talking about problem as the need to change the current state of affair. Depending on how much information you provide to the player, then you control and manipulate the ill definition of the problem. And you should stimulate, the game should stimulate engagement with ill-defined problems that can help players to learn to reason and act with insufficient information, applying system thinking. The other important thing is integrating a degree of change, uncertainty, unknowability, and uncontrollability in things, relationships, and events. This is obvious. Now, doing it the right way without disengaging player, it's not simple. First and foremost, this is not about randomness. This is about unpredictability and a degree of unpredictability. That means that as a designer, you have to come up with systems of things that act and react and interact based on patterns and ways of making patterns change over time to introduce that element of unpredictability that really helps player getting used to deal with complexity. Another important thing is ensuring that the problems that players have to face involve multiple actors, different roles, and conflicting interests. That is fundamental, all of these aspects. Then the situations that players face must require them to self-define objectives and should allow players to formulate multiple alternative approaches to tackle problems and pursue those objectives with different requirements and different consequences. Last but not least, gameplay tasks and non-player controlled events should generate multiple effects, and these effects should propagate across time and space. This is particularly important to promote the kind of big picture thinking which is imperative in the context of wicked problems. So we talked about wicked problems. Hopefully I didn't scare you, but they are scary in a way. Hopefully I demonstrated that there are ways of tackling them, and hopefully I demonstrated that actually there are approaches that can allow us to design games in order to foster the attitudes, the skill sets, and the development and acquisition and assimilation of information altogether required to tackle wicked problem scenarios. It was a lot of information. And in conclusion, I think that after the words, after the verba, we need the acta, we need action. And so what I think should be done, what I advocate is first and foremost, the problems are out there. They're not going to go. And we need to educate future generations. And we have a tremendous power in our ability to design and use games. We should join forces in continuous effort we should start thinking about gaming as a structural element of society, ongoing, as an opportunity which is always there to get together, do together, and learn together. And we should design games for that purpose. For this, we should, again, all together, identify wicked problems and opportunities to design and use games to tackle them. And we should design games together, not only within our environment, not only within our space, but globally, across the world, and involving the communities affected by these wicked problems. Equally important, we should involve game design learners in these kind of processes. Another important thing, in my opinion, is that we should study the impacts that these games have. We should investigate how players think, feel, and act whilst they play the game, and how the thinking, feeling, acting, and playing change, actually, the way they think, feel, and act in the context of wicked problems. And last but not least, we should disseminate impacts. Of course, there is the element for those of you who belong to the academia of scientific outlets and so on and so forth. And that's all fine. That's part of my job as well. However, I think that it's particularly important to explore and then inform the community about the financial and social profitability of these kind of games and the effects that they can generate. I think it's particularly important to think in terms of return over investment to investors. And remember that with wicked problems, it's not just about making money. It's about saving money that you should otherwise spend to address these problems. Remember the chaotic slide of everything being connected and governments investing a lot of money to just cope, patch, and try to mitigate. That's the point. And last but not least, dissemination means speaking to the public, means making them realize that there is a benefit to gaming and motivating them to engage in a large scale in the games that we will hopefully design and use. And this concludes my presentation. I will leave some readings. This is a world, a universe. There's a lot of information. I'm happy to engage in conversation with anyone who's interested after this presentation, and of course, address the questions now. But yeah, that's it. And I truly hope that we will join forces together, and I'm more than ready and happy to do so with you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Doctor, for your presentation. So if anyone has any questions, they can either post them in the Q&A or they can raise their hand. It looks like I can unmute you. We have a few minutes left in this slot. Okay, I have a message.
Yes.
Okay.
It will take some time to think about.
Yeah,
Yes.
there were a lot of very interesting comments. All right, so from Josh, do you think that there is ever a problem that is too wicked for a group or a community to address because it is too complicated for an individual or community to take on?
That's a good question. My take on that is that if the community is large enough and involves enough relevant actors, no, there isn't a wicked problem that cannot be tackled.
Any other questions? Oh, I have two more here. From Peter, great presentation. Would you identify building team culture, especially virtually, as a wicked problem?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. That's an interesting scenario, and it's something that I don't think can be tackled based on predefined formulas. I think it's something that should be tackled in an adaptive manner, starting perhaps with some structures and approaches to make people work together. But then, because we're talking about distributed agents, we are also talking about agents working in different contexts and being affected by their own lives in their own proximal space. And so it's particularly important not just to work together towards an objective, but also to monitor constantly how people work, what they are affected by, and then adapt collaborative strategies. That can become a culture, and yes, that should be developed, I agree, as such, as a culture.
Okay, and from David, do you have examples of games that succeed in this kind of way, or development of ones that seem promising in this way?
Right. I have an example of a game that can be used in this way, although it has not been developed in this way. And I'm thinking about Minecraft. And the reason why I'm thinking about Minecraft is because there are many of the things that I've discussed can be actually implemented using Minecraft as a part of a meta game. And so developing a context that is literally mounted on top of Minecraft. And so if you want, we can discuss that in detail. I'm not aware of games fully developed for this. I can tell you that we are, as we speak, we're actually evaluating the impacts of a game that has been developed by ourselves here in the UK with colleagues in Italy. And it integrates a lot of these things. And what we've seen actually is that those approaches really promote players to tackle complexity, work together, and learn how to work together, even if you have all the conditions that might actually disengage them in terms of uncertainty, uncontrollability, and unpredictability. So hopefully we're going to be able to publish information about this game and results from our experiments pretty soon. Stay tuned.
Great. And then I have a question from Nigna. Which sustainability concepts do you think game professionals often struggle to understand?
Right. One of the things that I think represents a significant shortfall are feelings and how much you have to design to trigger and orient feelings, not just the thinking. So that's a very basic thing. It's not about specific sustainability topics, but it's about the things that will inevitably influence the way you think about sustainability. Having said that, speaking about sustainability, there's the issue of consequences and scale. And that's a very big problem in sustainability games. They tend to be circumscribed in terms of space and time. They tend not to tackle enough the idea of consequences propagating across space and time. And there is also the issue of collaboration that very often is very limited in sustainability games. Last but not least, after I think we started investigating this about 12 years ago, well, after so long, the emphasis seems to be focused still on knowledge in the form of information predominantly. And I think that's not a good idea to really generate an impact on behaviors.
Sorry, it looks like our last question will come from Milo. Fab presentation. Is there a tension between changing attitudes and changing behavior or teaching skills? I'm asking because I work on theater, and there are often concerns about pieces of work that let people change their minds without changing their lives and can actually be a hindrance to positive change.
Yes. Yes, I agree about that problem being there and the significance of that problem. I think it's a big one. And because of that, in terms of attitude, we actually split what is the hope in the effects of action with the confidence in capability of action. I think that those are two attitudes that should come together in order to lead to behavior change. If I think that I can do something, but I'm not hopeful that that something can actually generate a positive impact, I'm not going to change my behavior. If I hope to be able to do something, but I don't think I can do that, I'm not going to change my behavior. So attitudes effectively are not a one thing phenomenon. They are a system. And if the system is correctly configured, then you can have behavior change. If one of them fail, then you might feel that you are facing people saying, yeah, you're right. That's super important, but I can't do it. Or, whatever I do, it's not going to be enough. And then you're going to have people perpetuating behaviors that rationally they think should be changed. So work on attitude. That's particularly important, and systemically.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Doctor, for your presentation.
Thank you
Thank
very
you,
much.
everyone who attended, and everyone enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.